Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Clean Tech Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
So we're getting close to June, and, the anticipation is building for the statistical review of World Energy 2025.
Always a big release in the energy calendar.
Exactly. So we thought, let's take a step back first. In this deep dive, we'll really unpack the findings from the 2024 report.
Makes sense. Look back before we look forward.
Right. And this report, it's now handled by the Energy Institute, working with KPMG and Kearney.
It's got a long history, hasn't it, since, 1952? Providing that objective data.
That's the one. So our mission today is basically to distill what the 2024 report, covering 2023 data, tells us about where global energy stood last year.
Absolutely. And 2023, well, it was quite a year to analyze.
So,
Think about the backdrop. It was the warmest year on record, wasn't it? Getting really close to that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold.
yeah, that was definitely headline news.
And then you layer on all the geopolitical stuff.
Yeah.
It's a really complex context for looking at these energy trends.
Okay, so let's get into it. The big picture overall energy consumption in 2023. What was the story?
Well, the headline is record global primary energy consumption hit an all-time high.
Again, wasn't 2022 also a record?
It was, yeah. This was up about 2% from 2022.
And how did that compare longer term?
It's significant. It was 0.6% above the 10-year average, and maybe more strikingly over 5% higher than pre-COVID levels, back in 2019.
Wow, so demand is really rebounding and growing. Who's driving that increase?
It's primarily countries outside the OECD.
Developing economies mostly.
Exactly. They dominate both the overall share of consumption and the year-on-year growth, industrial expansion, population growth.
Yeah.
It all feeds into higher energy needs.
Right, it shows how varied the energy picture is globally.
Definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Now, the elephant in the room often is fossil fuels. What did the review say about their use in 2023?
Well, despite everything else, global fossil fuel consumption also hit a record absolute high.
Seriously, a record for renewables and fossil fuels.
Yeah. It was up 1.5% from 2022, reaching 505 exajoules, which is just a mind-boggling number.
How did that break down?
It was mostly driven by coal, actually, up 1.6%, and oil was up 2%. Oil products alone went over 100 million barrels per day for the first time ever.
100 million barrels a day.
Yeah. Natural gas, interestingly, stayed flat compared to the year before.
So let me get this straight. Record renewable growth, which we'll get to, but also record fossil fuel use. How does that work?
That's the core tension, isn't it? It really highlights that renewables, while growing fast, just aren't yet scaling quickly enough to meet all the new energy demand and displace existing fossil fuels.
So overall, demand is growing faster than renewables can cover.
In essence, yes. And existing infrastructure, consumption patterns, they still heavily favor fossil fuels in many places. Progress is happening, but the sheer scale of global energy needs is immense.
Okay, let's switch to the positive side then. Renewables. What were the highlights there?
It's definitely a strong point in the report. Global renewable electricity generation, and this is excluding large hydro, it jumped by a record 13%.
13%. That sounds big.
It is. That's about 4,748 terawatt hours. Huge numbers. And wind and solar were the real stars.
Doubt so.
They accounted for, get this, 74% of all the net additional electricity generated worldwide. 3/4 of the new stuff was wind and solar.
Wow. Okay, that's some serious momentum. How did that change their share of the overall energy mix?
Right. So if you look at primary energy, renewables excluding hydro reach 8%. If you include hydro, it's 15%. So the overall share of all renewables, including hydro, went up by about 0.4 points to 14.6% of total primary energy.
So growing, but still less than a sixth of the total.
Exactly. And if you add nuclear into that clean energy mix together with renewables, it represents just over 18% of total primary energy.
And where was this renewable boom happening most intensely?
China.
Yeah.
Absolutely China. The report stated they added more renewable generation capacity in 2023 than the entire rest of the world put together.
That's staggering. Really shows the scale of their investment.
It really does. Massive deployment of wind and solar.
Okay, so we have record energy use, still heavily reliant on fossil fuels despite renewable growth, leads me to the inevitable question about emissions.
Yeah, unfortunately, the maths leads there.
Oh.
Greenhouse gas emissions, another record high in 2023.
Figures?
Up 2.1% overall, exceeding 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalent for the first time. That includes energy, industrial processes, flaring, methane.
And just from energy itself.
Energy-related emissions alone top 35 gigatons, also a first.
Any particular components driving that rise?
Well, CO2 from flaring jumped by 7%, which is quite a lot, and emissions from methane and industrial processes were also up over 5% each, so not heading in the right direction overall.
No, definitely not. Now, these global numbers are useful, but you mentioned earlier how varied things are. What did the report show regionally?
Yes, this is where it gets really interesting. Europe, for example.
What happened there?
For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels fell below 70% of their primary energy use.
Below 70%. That sounds like a major milestone.
It is. It was a combination of factors, really. Lower energy demand overall, plus that growth in renewables we talked
And
about.
gas. Big changes there, too.
Huge. Gas demand fell another 7% in 2023, and that was after a 13% drop the year before.
Wow. And Russia's role.
Drastically reduced. Russia's share of EU gas imports dropped all the way down to 15%, a massive shift in just a couple of years.
Okay, so that's Europe. What about the U.S.?
The U.S. also saw a dip in fossil fuel share, fell to 80% of their total primary energy, so still high but moving slightly.
And India. You mentioned strong growth there.
Very different story. Fossil fuel consumption in India grew by 8%. That accounted for almost all their demand growth.
8%.
Yeah, and their share reached 89% of overall consumption. And here's a striking fact. For the first time, India used more coal than Europe and North America combined.
More coal than Europe and North America put together. Wow.
Yeah.
That really highlights the different trajectories.
Absolutely. Different stages of development, different priorities, different transition speeds.
What about Africa?
Africa actually saw a small decrease in primary energy consumption, about 0.5% down.
Oh, interesting. But the mix.
Still heavily dominated by fossil fuels, about 90% of their overall consumption. And renewables, excluding hydro, are still a very small part of electricity generation, only around 6%.
Okay. And finally, China. We heard about their huge renewable build-out, but what about their overall picture?
Well, their fossil fuel use did increase in 2023, up 6%, partly as the economy fully reopened post-COVID. It hit a new high in absolute terms.
About their share.
The share of fossil fuels in their primary energy mix has actually been falling since 2011. It reached 81.6% in 2023, so still high, but trending down slowly despite absolute growth.
And another interesting point from the report.
Yeah, China's energy consumption per person overtook Europe's for the first time.
Per capita. That's quite a shift.
Reflects their economic growth.
Okay, let's maybe drill down into specific fuels a bit more. Oil, we heard consumption topped 100 million barrels per day. What about production?
Production also hit a record 96 million barrels per day globally.
And the U.S. role there?
The U.S. was the largest producer, yeah. Their output grew by over 8%, which is substantial.
Any other production trends?
What's quite interesting is that production from countries outside the OPEC Plus group grew significantly. It actually exceeded the growth in global oil demand by about 20%.
So non-OPEC Plus is really ramping up. And prices, they were crazy in 2022.
They came down a fair bit. Brent crude averaged about $83 a barrel. That's down 18% from 2022.
But still high compared to before.
Oh, yeah. Still 29% above pre-COVID 2019 levels, so elevated, but not the peaks we saw right after the invasion of Ukraine.
And regional consumption for oil.
Asia-Pacific saw strong growth, over 5% increase. Europe, on the other hand, saw a small decrease, nearly 1%.
Got it. Let's turn to natural gas. You said consumption was flat globally, but prices moved a lot.
Big time. Huge drops in prices from the 2022 highs. Europe and Asia saw prices fall by about 30%,
Yuck.
averaged around $13 per million BTU. And in the U.S., the Henry Hub price fell even more, like 60%.
60%. Wow.
Yeah, brought U.S. prices back down to pre-COVID levels, around $2.50 per minute too.
And production. You said flat overall.
Pretty much stable globally. The U.S. remained the biggest producer, but output fell in Europe and the CIS countries. Russia saw the biggest drop in output, down 5%.
In trade. Particularly LNG, liquefied natural gas.
Yeah, LNG trades saw some shifts. The main growth in demand came from Asia-Pacific, China, India, other non-OECD countries there.
Not Europe. Imports were down there.
Surprisingly, yeah. LNG imports into Europe actually fell a bit, as did imports into OECD Asia-Pacific.
Huh. I thought Europe was scrambling for LNG.
They imported a lot in 2022 to replace Russian pipeline gas, but maybe demand reduction and filled storage played a role in 2023, imports slightly decreasing, and China regained its spot as the world's biggest LNG importer.
Okay. What about pipeline gas trade?
That's on overall drop, net trade down about 8%. Mostly because Russian pipeline supplies to Europe fell so dramatically, down 26%.
But Russia's sending more elsewhere.
Yes, their pipeline exports to China surged, up 45%.
Interesting dynamic. And the overall role of LNG in traded gas.
It's becoming dominant. LNG now accounts for nearly 59% of all gas traded globally.
And the U.S. is leading that.
Yep. The U.S. became the world's #1 LNG supplier in 2023.
Okay. Let's touch on coal quickly. We know India's consumption surpassed Europe and North America combined. What about production?
Global coal production also hit a record high.
Another record.
Seems to be the theme. Asia-Pacific produced almost 80% of the world's coal.
Concentrated where?
Mainly Australia, China, India, and Indonesia. But China alone was responsible for over half more than 50% of global production.
Just staggering scale. And consumption in developed economies.
Continued its decline. Europe and North America kept reducing coal use.
Right. Moving to electricity. Overall generation.
Increased by 2.5%, another record level globally.
Demand patterns.
Demand grew in Asia-Pacific and the Middle East, but it actually fell in Europe and North America, mirroring some of those primary energy trends.
And the generation mix for electricity.
Fossil fuels still provided the bulk, about 60%.
Still the majority.
Yeah. But renewable share climbed to 30%. That's significant progress. Nuclear held steady at around 9%.
Any other electricity trends? Storage.
Yes. The report noted the growth in grid-scale battery storage, BSS. Global capacity reached 56 gigawatts.
And China's role there.
Dominant again. Nearly half of that global battery storage capacity is in China.
Finally, the report added some new data this time, right? On critical minerals.
Yes, that was a key addition. New data sets covering things like battery storage in more detail, carbon capture, hydrogen, ammonia, uranium, but also key minerals and materials.
Like what?
Things essential for batteries, mainly natural graphite, rare earths, manganese, platinum group metals, nickel, lithium.
And where are these coming from?
The report highlights that the Asia-Pacific region produced nearly 70% of the metals and materials critical for lithium-ion batteries in 2023.
Heavy concentration there. And prices.
Prices for many metals actually fell from their 2022 peaks, but lithium carbonate prices, for example, remain way higher than before COVID, still significantly elevated.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, quite a deep dive into the 2024 Statistical Review. What's the single biggest takeaway message you think?
I'd say it's the sheer complexity and maybe the unevenness of the energy transition right now.
How do you mean?
Well, you've got these parallel records, right? Record energy consumption, record emissions,
Yeah.
but also record renewable generation. It just screams complexity.
Yeah, it's not a simple story of one replacing the other just yet.
Not at all. We're trying to decarbonize while global energy demand keeps rising, and those regional differences are huge. You see fossil fuels potentially peaking in places like Europe, while demand is still growing strongly in India and parts of the global south. The transition isn't monolithic.
Different speeds, different paths.
Exactly. And the new data on minerals just shows how the focus is evolving, too. It's not just about the fuels anymore, but the whole supply chain for the transition.
Absolutely. A really fascinating and maybe slightly sobering picture from the 2024 data. Now, if you listening want to be among the first to hear about the upcoming 2025 report, I definitely recommend subscribing to the Energy Institute's newsletter.
Good tip. And maybe something for listeners to ponder. Considering all these trends we've discussed,
Yeah.
what single factor do you think will be the most influential in actually accelerating the energy transition in the next few years?
That's a good question to leave people with. Technology, policy, investment, public pressure.
Lots to think about.